The North Point Lighthouse rose like a bone-white finger against the darkening sky, its ancient stone weathered by centuries of storms. Thomas Blackwood had been its keeper for 6 years, inheriting the position after his uncle's mysterious disappearance. The isolation had never bothered him before. He preferred the company of seabirds to people, the rhythm of waves to city noise. But as spring storms gathered on the horizon, something changed in his orderly world. It began with the logbook. While reviewing the previous month's entries, Thomas noticed discrepancies in his own handwriting. Notes he couldn't remember making, written in a hand that was his but somehow different. They're watching from the depths. The light knows. Keep it burning, keep it burning, keep it burning. The mechanical anomalies started soon after. The Great Fresnel lens, a marvel of 19th century engineering that had functioned flawlessly for decades, developed a stutter in its beam. Thomas spent days checking every gear, every connection, every piece of the ancient mechanism. Everything was in perfect working order, yet the light continued its irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat, like a pulse, like something alive. One stormy evening, as he made his regular checks in the lantern room, Thomas saw the first ship. It emerged from the fog, a merchant vessel with square-rigged sails that belonged to another century. Through his binoculars, he could make out every detail: the intricately carved wooden rails, the weather-beaten deck, the empty wheel spinning slowly in the wind. But no crew, no movement, just darkness where people should be. Between one sweep of the light and the next, the ship vanished. Thomas convinced himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination born from too many solitary hours. But then he began seeing more. Shadows that moved against the wind, forming shapes that defied natural law. They danced at the edge of the beam, their forms elongating and contracting like creatures from the deepest trenches of the ocean. The whispers came next. At first, they blended with the wind, barely distinguishable from the normal sounds of the lighthouse. But they grew clearer, more insistent. Words in languages long dead, voices that carried impossible weight. They spoke of depths and darkness, of ancient pacts and the price of keeping watch. Thomas started sleeping in the lantern room, afraid to let the light out of his sight. He kept his logbook close, documenting everything with fevered precision. The entries grew more erratic. Day 147. The beam shows things that cannot be. Ships that sailed centuries ago. Faces in the fog. Day 148. The whispers are louder. They know my name. Day 149. Something watches from the water. The light keeps it at bay. Must keep the light burning. Day 150. Found scratches on the inside of the windows. They're trying to get in. Day 151. The light is more than a light. God help me, I'm beginning to understand. As spring storms intensified, so did the visions. The shadows grew bolder, pressing against the windows during his nightly watches. Sometimes, in the brief moments between the beam's rotations, Thomas caught glimpses of faces in the glass. Pale, bloated faces with eyes that reflected green light where there should be only darkness. He stopped using his mirrors after finding handprints on their surfaces. Handprints that appeared on the reflective side of the glass. The discovery of James Morrison's journal marked a turning point. Thomas found it while replacing wiring in the service room, hidden behind an old cabinet that hadn't been moved in decades. The leather binding was crusted with salt, its pages yellowed and warped, but the words inside were clear enough to change everything he thought he knew about the lighthouse. Morrison's entries began in 1887, mundane at first. Weather reports, maintenance logs, supply requests. But as Thomas read through the night, lamp oil burning low, the entries transformed into something else entirely. March 15, 1887. The light speaks. Not in words, but I understand. There are things in the water. Ancient things. Hungry things. March 20th. They come with the fog. The drowned ones. The light holds them back, but they're patient. So patient. They've waited centuries. They can wait longer. March 25th. Found symbols carved into the mechanism. They move when I'm not looking. The brass remembers things. It knows what it was made for. April 3rd. God forgive me, I understand now. The lighthouse was never meant to guide ships to safety. It's a ward. A barrier. The light doesn't show the way, it holds back the dark. The final entry was dated April 15, 1887, the ink splattered as if written in haste. If the light fails, the sea takes its due. They are waiting, always waiting. The darkness is theirs, but the light holds them back. Keep it burning, or join them. The choice comes to all keepers in the end. I've made mine. God help those who follow. That night, as if responding to Thomas's discovery, the worst storm in decades struck the coast. The lighthouse groaned under assault from winds that carried voices, thousands of voices, calling his name. The mechanism began failing in ways that defied logic and physics. New problems appeared between each check, as if something was actively working to extinguish the light. During his repairs, Thomas discovered more signs of the lighthouse's true nature. Symbols etched into the brass work that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Patterns in the metalwork that formed impossible geometries. And everywhere, evidence of previous keepers' desperate attempts to maintain the light. Makeshift repairs made with materials that shouldn't exist, modifications to the mechanism that violated several laws of physics. The logbooks of other keepers began appearing too, tucked into corners he'd sworn were empty before. Each told fragments of the same story. The visions, the whispers, the growing understanding of the lighthouse's purpose. Some keepers had fled, only to be found later, drowned in calm seas. Others had stayed and changed. Thomas found himself making modifications to the mechanism, guided by knowledge he shouldn't possess. His hands moved with certainty while his mind recoiled at what he was creating. The brass work began to resemble something organic, pulsing with a life of its own. The light's beam grew stronger, but its color shifted subtly, taking on an otherworldly quality that made the fog recoil. The night the light died, Thomas was prepared. Or so he thought. It happened at midnight, during the worst storm yet. The mechanism didn't sputter or fade, it simply stopped, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. The darkness that rushed in wasn't natural. It moved with purpose, with hunger, with ancient patience finally rewarded. The fog came next, but it didn't roll in from the sea. It materialized from the air itself, thick and gray and wrong, carrying the scent of salt and decay and something older, something that had waited in the deep since before humans first feared the dark. In its depths, Thomas saw them clearly for the first time. They came in waves, each more horrifying than the last. The recently drowned came first, their flesh still relatively intact, water streaming from their blue-tinged lips. Their eyes reflected light that didn't exist, and their movements were too fluid, too purposeful for dead things. Behind them came older victims, centuries of them. Bodies in various stages of decay, wearing clothing from every era. Victorian dresses bloated with seawater, modern diving suits crushed by pressure, ancient sailors still wrapped in rotting ropes. Some were little more than bones held together by seaweed and coral, yet they moved with terrible grace. They began to ascend the lighthouse, passing through solid stone as if it were no more substantial than their fog. Each brought the cold of the depths with them, and ice began forming on the windows, from the inside. Their voices were clearer now, no longer whispers but a chorus of the drowned, singing songs of darkness and depths and the peace that comes with surrendering to the tide. Thomas retreated to the lantern room, where the dead mechanism lay silent. In its brass surface, he saw his reflection change. His skin had taken on a greenish tinge, and water dripped from his hair though he was dry moments ago. His eyes had begun to reflect that same impossible light he'd seen in the drowned ones. The choice became clear, just as Morrison's journal had warned. The light could be relit, but it required more than oil or electricity. It needed a keeper, not just to maintain it, but to become part of it. Every keeper before him had faced this choice: become one with the mechanism that held back the dark, or join the ranks of the watching dead. The drowned ones pressed closer. Among them, Thomas recognized faces from the photographs in the lighthouse archives. Former keepers who had chosen the sea. His uncle was there too, skin gray-green and eyes full of silent invitation. Water began pooling at Thomas's feet, rising impossibly up through the floorboards. The brass of the mechanism grew warm under his hands, pulsing like a heart. The symbols etched into its surface crawled across the metal, reaching for his fingers. They spelled out truths he finally understood, about the lighthouse, about the light, about what really lurked in the depths of the ocean. This far from shore, this high above the waves, he could hear the real song of the sea. Not the peaceful whisper that poets wrote about, but the true voice of the depths, ancient, hungry, and patient. So patient. The drowned ones were just its chorus, its lures, its way of adding to its collection of souls. Thomas made his choice. They say North Point Lighthouse still stands, its beam cutting through the worst storms without fail. Sailors report that its light seems different now, stronger, stranger, somehow alive. On clear nights, it casts shadows that move against the wind. In heavy fog, people sometimes see faces in its beam. The lighthouse has no official keeper anymore. Supply boats leave provisions at the dock, but no one goes inside. The logbook ends with a final entry, written in handwriting that seems to shift as you read it. The light must never die. I understand now. I am the light, and the light is me. We keep the darkness at bay. We give the drowned ones no peace. This is our purpose. This is our eternity. And we will not fail. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, if you watch the lighthouse carefully, you might see a figure in the lantern room. It tends to the light with endless devotion, its movements too fluid to be fully human. And if you look through binoculars, you might notice that the figure casts no reflection in the glass. But most people know better than to look too closely at North Point Lighthouse. They keep their distance, hurry past its beam, and try to ignore the whispers that come with the fog. They try not to think about what might happen if the light ever truly goes out. After all, the sea is patient, and it keeps what it takes.